And so we're here today, and he'll be discussing In Search of Landfall, which is a memoir. Well, it's an odyssey here of indefatigable adventurer. And he has had a really successful writing career. Many of his travels from his first book, Reports of Beyond, which was published in 2008, it did really well and was reviewed really well. And his travels have been published in The Guardian, The Telegraph, The Sunday Telegraph, The Independent, and The Sunday Times. He's been on Radio 4. He's been at the Edinburgh Book Festival before. And we're really looking forward to hearing him do a reading from his current book.
Welcome. Thanks very much for coming. And it's a real pleasure to be reappearing at the Edinburgh Book Festival again. Can everybody hear me okay? I'd like to begin with a few words about my two books because they complement each other. And I feel that they fit this afternoon's theme very well. The first one, Reports from Beyond, describes mainly my outer journeys to some of the world's most remote places, such as the Republic of Kiribati in the Central Pacific, or the Kingdom of Guji in Western Tibet. Some of these places so remote that some people have never even heard of them. But my new book, In Search of Landfall, focuses more on my inner journeys by describing my childhood in Sussex and Edinburgh and my time as a radical student at Edinburgh University in the 60s, my time and my life in Amsterdam and the often exhilarating counterculture of Amsterdam in the 1970s, as well as the cast of exhilarating characters that I've been fortunate enough to meet in my life, some of them very famous, such as Norman McCaig, who taught me at primary school, or Indira Gandhi, who I met when I was one of 3 drivers who drove a bus containing 30 Edinburgh University students overland to India in 1967. And then there was Robin Cook, who I shared, the future former Foreign Secretary, who I shared a flat with in my 4th year at university. And last but not least, the incomparably great Argentinian writer Jorge Luis Borges, who I had an exceedingly traumatic encounter with in Argentina in 1976 during the so-called Dirty War in Argentina. The subtitle of In Search of Landfall, on which I'm going to concentrate tonight, is The Odyssey of an Indefatigable Adventurer. Now, landfall means, of course, arrival at land after being at sea. And odyssey means a long and eventful journey. But here in the book, both are metaphors for what happened in my first 40 years. And this is only about my first 40 years. And the book's underlining theme is my search for answers to some of the most important questions that we're all faced with, such as who are we, what are we doing here, and where are we going? The structure of the book is loosely based on Homer's Odyssey. Now, Odysseus, of course, was a Greek hero who had to undertake many challenging voyages. That doesn't mean that I see myself as a hero. But like Odysseus, between the ages of 20 and 40, I also had very many dramatic adventures. And like him, I had to battle through many storms, in my case, metaphorically speaking. And like him, I was in my 40s when I finally made landfall, i.e., I found a set of values that enabled me to envisage what sort of person I wanted to become. So the chapters of the book are therefore nautical metaphors about what happened to Odysseus and myself. Take the chapter Changing Tack, which is based on how Odysseus changed course soon after he left Troy, and I also began a radical change of direction at university. Here's a short edited extract to explain how it all began. That summer, in 1968, I decided to travel around the States. It was a very dramatic journey. First, I went to Washington, D.C., to find it literally smoldering after police had quelled devastating riots in the Black Ghetto. Next, I traveled to Texas, but I was so shocked by what was going on in the States, Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy had just been assassinated, that I decided to go to Mexico City instead. I didn't stay long. The atmosphere there was equally explosive, as security forces had just gunned down 25 students demonstrating against the Olympic Games it was due to host. Unsure what to do, I was in the main square when I saw a bus with Guatemala City written above the cab. And it sounded so appealing that I promptly bought a ticket, and 28 hours after arriving in Mexico City, I was in Guatemala City. It was like going from the frying pan into the fire. Left-wing guerrillas had just assassinated the US ambassador, a right-wing military junta had just seen power, and there were tanks in the streets. So for the second time in as many days, I didn't delay, but next morning left for the countryside. At last, I traveled up to San Francisco, but because, like some Marxist students, I regarded drugs and the pop culture as counter-revolutionary, I was still, in many ways, remarkably naive. It was just after the Summer of Love and Flower Power, and I can still see the advertisements for the Grateful Dead and Jefferson Airplane in Haight-Ashbury, the centre of the counterculture, and picture myself wondering who on earth they were. That was my first experience of the counterculture, which leads me on to a chapter called Dropping Anchor. This is based on how Odysseus stopped off in the tempting land of the Lotus Eaters, and describes how I myself also stopped off in an equally seductive place. Let me explain a little. Like a lot of radical students in the 1960s, I was very disillusioned by our failure to change society. So, attracted by its wild reputation, in 1973 I went to Amsterdam for the weekend, little realizing that I was going to stay there for the next 11 years. Here are two short extracts about events in the Milky Way and the Paradiso, the two main centers of the counterculture in Amsterdam. Now, I've chosen these as a deliberate contrast to what Elizabeth may or may not read, and these events may now appear to some of us as self-indulgent. But I would like to remind you that it was the 60s and the 70s that, whatever their excesses and whatever you like to think about them, lay the seeds for many of our present-day freedoms, such as gay rights, rights for women, and so on. And it was irreverent events like these that helped challenge the stifling conformity of what were then often very deferential societies. First, an evening during an avant-garde literary festival in the Milky Way. First on stage was Patti Smith, then still a little-known punk poet. Next was Ken Kesey, author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, who recounted how, hallucinating on LSD, he and his merry pranksters had traveled across America in their psychedelically painted ex-school bus. Last came an emaciated, conventional-looking man wearing a suit, a tie, and a pudding bowl hat. He looked like a used car salesman, but it was a cult writer, William Burroughs, who, to general hilarity, then read out such an outrageous poem about the Queen and her corgis that I daren't even mention the title here, although it's in the book. Now, here's a short extract about one evening in the Paradiso, the second centre of the counterculture, during its One World International Poetry Festival. Inside, on the stage in the darkened hall, poets such as Yevtushenko, the critical acclaimed Russian dissident, read their poems, followed by a 12-piece reggae band. Suddenly, at 2 a.m., flashing strobe lights illuminated a gargantuan silver globe suspended from the ceiling. Then it sank to the dance floor where, to the disbelief of the gasping multitude, The upper half rose to reveal a perspiring, stark-naked black man with a 15-foot-long python coiled round his waist. As the music reached a crescendo and the hall was wreathed in smoke, he performed a highly erotic dance until he unwound the snake from his sweating torso and released it into the audience. Obviously, everybody scattered until, too stoned to care, they enveloped him again to dance the night away. That was a taste of William Burroughs and the counterculture of Amsterdam in the 70s. It was then that, based in Amsterdam, I really started traveling. And on three separate occasions, each time for a year, I went to South America, I went to Southeast Asia and Central Africa. At last, like Odysseus, who finally made his way back to Ithaca, I also made my way home, in my case, of course, to Edinburgh. However, I continued my journeys, and as I did, I became more and more interested in cultural themes, such as shark worshipping in the Solomon Islands, or eagle hunters of Mongolia, or cargo cults in Vanuatu in the Pacific. I also found myself increasingly traveling through Buddhist countries, such as Burma, parts of India and China and Japan. For a while, this seemed to me to be accidental until I realized I was actually being drawn to them unconsciously. So, influenced by their spirituality, back in Edinburgh, I joined a Buddhist meditation group, which helped me focus on my inner journey. Finally, here's a very brief extract, a very brief account about a very powerful experience I had in 1979 when I climbed to Mount Everest Base Camp in Nepal, which very few people did at that time. I was at 16,000 feet and had pitched my tent with great difficulty in rock-hard ground near a primitive stone hut of an asthmatic old Sherpa. As it was the last human habitation before base camp, I'd spent the evening with him until I'd gone outside to get some fresh air. It was a clear, still night, and a brilliant full moon had just heaved itself above the sheer black amphitheatre formed by the peaks of Nuptse, 26,000 feet on my left, Lhotse, 28,000 feet on my right, and in the middle, towering an incredible 29,000 feet into the starlit sky, Mount Everest, with its characteristic plume of white cloud streaming from its summit. Suddenly, down below me, a dark shape stirred. I'd startled one of a large herd of shaggy black yaks sleeping in a nearby rocky corral. All of a sudden, its bell started tinkling, which woke up another yak, and its bell started tinkling, then another, and another, until at last dozens and dozens of yak bells were tinkling harmoniously in what sounded like a symphony orchestra tuning up for some vast cosmic concert, and I was being bathed by what seemed, at the time, some of the most sublime music I've ever heard. And on those notes, I'd like to leave you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patrick. I'd like to ask you a couple questions, and I'd like to start off. So your first book was a travel memoir. You talked about it very much as an outer journey. Can you talk a little bit about how writing a memoir and so much more about your inner journey, how that was different from writing the travel memoir, the travel book?
Well, my first book was about, as you say, me traveling to very far away, remote places. And this book is more about the spaces in between. And it was a very interesting process because dealing with memory is a fascinating process. And whereas I had a lot of notes about my journeys, because wherever I went, I always took notes with me. Writing my memoir, I didn't have so many notes, although I was helped by, latterly, after my mother died, by coming across her diaries, which helped me to write in great detail about my childhood in Sussex. And of course, if you write a memoir, you have to be very careful, because you're almost certainly going to offend somebody. And I didn't want to offend anybody. And I was drawn between just going for it and saying what I thought, in my opinion, I knew to be true, and whether that would offend somebody or not. So what I did was, practically everybody in the book who was in the book, I met them and I asked them if they would be comfortable about what I was going to write with them. And practically everybody did.
Did you actually give them the text?
I gave them the text. And where there were certain parts of the book which I thought would really cause offense, I left them out completely. And I dare say that some of the most interesting parts of the book I have left out, but I hope that they've been made up by other equally interesting parts.
So now, I didn't know that you had the diaries of your mom's.
Yes.
I didn't know that you had your mother's diary. Did that impact? So if you've read the book, it's lovely. It starts very much almost in her head, and you say this is what she was like and this is what she felt. Did some of that knowledge come from those diaries?
Absolutely, yes. And my mother was an intrepid traveller in her own right, and at the age of 5, she went off with her father on a biplane driven by one of the world's most famous pioneering aviators, and latterly went off by herself to the Soviet Union. She went to Greece. She traveled through Italy in 1936 during the time of Mussolini. And she was a wonderful writer, and I remember a phrase of hers that I came across in the book, which I'll never forget, which was she said how she bathed naked in Lake Garda in Italy on a moonlit night, and then lay eating grapes in a moonlit vineyard. And I thought that was a beautiful...
I wonder where...
Although I'm not sure I want to see my mother bathing naked.
And that may be where some of your traveling urges come from. I think we're going to move on to Elizabeth Laird. Thank you very much, Patrick, and we'll have loads of time for questions at the end.
Scottish explorer James Bruce went to Ethiopia, and in 1770 said that he had discovered the source of the Blue Nile, and he then wrote a book about it, and the book was wildly successful in London salons in 1990, until people began to doubt it. And then somebody once asked him what kind of instruments were played at the court of an Empress Mentewab, and he said, lyres. And somebody in the salon said, yes, and there goes the biggest one of them all.
Oh, yes.
In Ethiopia, practically every church claims to have a copy of it, which is called the taboo. And every January they have these ceremonies where the priests carry copies of the taboos on their heads. Anyway, I went up to Axum, which was once the center of a huge empire, and now it's just a dusty little village. And when I was there, I went to see it, and I happened to meet the local guide, and we stood outside the church, which is quite a new church, which claims to have the Ark of the Covenant inside it. And it's guarded by one of the most senior priests up there. And I knew that you couldn't get into it, but I said to the guide, I said, any chance of being able to get in to see the Ark of the Covenant? And he said to me, well, and he was referring to the Bible here, said, not unless you want to burst into flames.
Exactly.
Which is what happened to everybody in the Bible who saw the Ark of the Covenant.
Exactly. Yes.
Good. I can tell you, Patrick is definitely a blagger. Like, he can get in almost anywhere, and you can see that with you as well. In order to get where you need to go, and you need to do exactly that. And no harm in asking. It's gotten you many places.
One of the things that I always take with me is a Lonely Planet phrase book, because there's nothing that opens up people as much as trying to speak their own language and possibly even making a fool of yourself. And one of the great journeys that I ever made was when I went to Mongolia, and I went the whole way across Mongolia to the very western edge of it. And Mongolia is a huge place. It's the size of Western Europe, and there's 2.5 million people, and 1.5 million of them live in Ulaanbaatar, and 1 million live outside in a country the size of Western Europe with 1 million people. Anyway, I had a great driver, and he taught me a few Mongolian phrases, and one of them was the greeting for all nomads, and we always stayed in nomads' tents, and one of them was Nokhoi Choreo, which means literally call off the dogs. Because wherever you go, the first thing that happens to you is you are assaulted by packs of wild, rabid-looking dogs. So I learned that phrase, and then I learned another phrase, which was Mal Surig Targan Taftau. Now, Mongolian is an absolutely ferociously difficult language with dozens of vowels all strung together. And I thought I had got this right. And whenever I went into a ger, I always said, Nokhoi Choreo. And then one evening I went in and I said, Mal Sureg Targan Taftau. And the whole ger completely cracked up in laughter. And I had a translator with me, and I didn't know why they were laughing. And Mal Sureg Targan Taftau literally means, I hope your animals are fattening up nicely. And as I say, I went into the ger one evening, and I thought I'd got this right, and they all cracked up laughing. And afterwards, 5 minutes, I said to them, why are they all laughing? And she turned to me, she said, because, Patrick, you've just said, I hope your wife's fattening up nicely.
Hi, Patrick. You talk about your inner journeys and your book about your travels and your inner journeys. So I'd really like to hear what you've learned, what you might share with us. Where have you gone in this inner journey, and what is the lessons, or a lesson?
Well, traveling, outer journeys taught me a lot of things. I mean, they taught me, for example, of how to handle myself in life. And they taught me, for example, to face my mortality, where I was once one of the very few people who has possibly ever found a gap in the 2-meter thick ice of Lake Baikal in January in Siberia, fallen through it, and lived to tell the tale. And Elizabeth might be interested in that, because when I was Googling her, I saw that one of her interests in life is places in between. So perhaps we can talk about that later on. But coming back to your question, it taught me also that I had skills that I didn't know that I possessed. And apart from making me feel at home wherever I go, because I know I can handle myself, although I'm continually taken by surprise, I often remember when I went to Zaire, and I was on the border of Zaire and Uganda, and suddenly 5 drunken young soldiers burst out of a mud hut and accosted me and demanded my passport and my money and my camera. And it wasn't until I admired their Kalashnikovs and said how virile and manly they looked in their uniforms, and then complimented them on the fact that Zaire had just qualified for the first time for the World Cup, that they not only waved me on, but allowed me to take a photograph of them. And it wasn't until 2 weeks later I discovered that they'd just been beaten 9-1 by Yugoslavia.
Oh!
And on that note, which Scottish people will be very kind of familiar with, being beaten in football. We're going to need to call it a day in terms of time, but thank you so much for making this such a lovely event to be part of. Clearly, we have all so many questions and could hear so many tales, in particular because you have both been traveling so much into so many countries. So I would like to thank Patrick Richardson and Elizabeth Baird, and you as a wonderful audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.